peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 4 of the Butterick 6554 sew along. Today we're going to be assembling the skirt. We're going to be putting together the flounces and attaching those to the skirt, finishing the hem and finishing the dress. So let's get started. Okay, the first step is number 37, and that's to sew the skirt back sections together. But I eliminated the back seam because I couldn't see a point to it. So we can skip that section if you've done the same. Next, we're going to stitch the skirt fronts to the skirt back at the side, matching the double notches. And guess what? I'm going to do it with a French seam. So that's the first order of business. So I have French seamed the skirt sides to the skirt back, and I'm now going to press the seams towards the front because we've pressed the seams of the bodice towards the back. So again, we'll be able to nest those seams when we come to put the bodice onto the skirt. So I'm going to go press these towards the front. Okay, so the next thing that it would like us to do is stay stitch the upper edge of the skirt, and we're going to do that at 3/8 of an inch. Once we've done that, I'm going to move on to making the flounces. So you need to stitch the front flounce to the back flounce sections at the sides, matching the double notches. I have actually done the same thing that I have done with the bodice. I have cut out double the amount, so I'm going to sew the two sides to the back, and then I'm going to repeat that process, and then I'm going to sew them together. Okay, so I've sewn the front flounces to the back flounce and at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I've pressed that open, and I've done that to both the outer and, for want of a better term, lining piece. And I'm now going to match up the large outer edge of the flounce and sew them together at 3/8 of an inch. So that's a lot of points to match up. So I'm going to start by matching up the seams, and then I'm going to pin all around the outer edge of the flounce and sew it at 3/8 of an inch. I've sewn the outer edge of the ruffle together, so now I am going to use my pinking shears and pink close to the line of stitching to finish the edge, and also to help me turn the ruffle out so that I can press it with ease. The edge is all pinked. That is a long edge. I'm now going to go and press it so that it's wrong sides together, and that's going to be a long process as well, but it's going to be worth it, I think. So I've pressed the edge, and I am now going to stitch together the flounce, and it's also going to serve as stay stitching, so I'm going to do that at 3/8 of an inch the whole way around, stitching together the two sides. Okay, so I've basically just done step 42. So I've stay stitched the notched edge of the flounce, which is the inner edge, which is going to get attached to the skirt, and then it's basically describing a narrow rolled hem here, but we don't need to do that, or at least I don't need to do that, because I have done a double layer. So my hem is all finished neatly on the inside. So next step is 43, and it says, with right sides together, pin flounce to skirt, matching symbols and clipping flounce where necessary. Stitch and stitch again 1/4 of an inch 6mm away in seam allowance. I'm actually going to do this a little bit differently. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch all the way around, and then I'm going to finish my raw edge with bias binding because that is my preferred finishing method. Again, if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you will know this. So I'm going to match up the side seams, the notches, the single notch there, and then there is a mark on the skirt where the flounce should finish, but I'm not going to worry about that too much because I'm just going to put the flounce up as far as it will go. So I'm going to get that all pinned on and sewn on at 5/8 of an inch. So the flounce is now sewn on, and now I need to give it a good press, and I'm going to press it so that the seam allowance goes up into the skirt. Then I'm going to finish the seam allowance off with some bias binding. Okay, so the next step is to 44, and it's to make a 5/8 of an inch 1.5cm narrow hem front opening edge of skirt above large circles, turning flounce down and press. I'm going to differ from this, and I've already sewn on my bias binding because I would like to bind the hem, because I think that is going to look much nicer, and it also very neatly encloses the raw edge of the flounce. So I have sewn my bias binding onto the wrong side of the skirt. This one is actually, once it's turned over, it's quite a bit bigger than the 1/4 inch that I used on the waist, so it's going to work quite nicely because I'll be able to sew this down and then turn it under and stitch it down to the right side of the skirt so that it will be turned under, but I'll show you that as I go along. But the first step is to sew your bias binding to the wrong side of your skirt. So the next thing that I'm going to do, I've got my blind hem foot on because this is how I like to attach the binding. I'm going to flip this round to the right side. Flip that around to the right side, and then I'm going to top stitch this part down with my blind hem foot. Okay, so I have folded my tape over, I have top stitched it down, I have now pressed it up to the main body of the skirt. So this is the flounce here, and then so this is pressed up here, and I'm now going to top stitch this side down to the main body of the skirt. So I've top stitched my binding down all the way on the inside, and then this is what it looks like from the outside. The next step is 45, and with right sides together, pin skirt to bodice, matching centres and seams, and clipping skirt where necessary, baste, turn lower edge of front facing down and over seam, stitch to waist through all layers, stitch again 1/4 inch 6mm again away in seam allowance, trimmed close to stitching. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to French seam it. I'm guessing that's coming as no surprise to any of you. We shall get that done, and then I will have to put in my buttonhole for my tie. So I'm going to do that now. So I've matched up the side seams. There's 2 notches. So there's one and there's the other. So I've matched up the notches, and I'm now going to sew this at 1/4 inch, and I've got the wrong sides together because I'm going to French seam it. With the facing, I've kept that out of the way because I'm going to fold that back in on itself and stitch that down once the French seam is done. So I'm going to sew along here at 1/4 inch, and just be careful with the skirt that none of the fullness gets caught in it. Just feel along as you go, sew slowly, and you should be okay. So once you've finished French seaming the waistband, which I've done here, we then need to finish off the facing so that you end up with something that looks like this. This has not been pressed yet, but I wanted to do this side to make sure that I was getting it right so that I could show you how I did it. So I'll show you on the other side. Okay, so this is the bodice. That's the waist seam that we've just done, and this is the facing. So you should end up with something that looks a bit like this. That's the skirt piece, this is the waist tie, this is the facing, and this is the bodice, and this is the waist seam. So you want to fold the facing back along the waist seam that you've just finished, and you want to make sure that the tie is definitely out of the way and that everything is lying flatly. And this, because we French seamed it, this is actually going to stick up around about sort of 1/8, nearly 1/4 inch. And what you want to do is, you want, with everything lying flat, you want to sew from the edge of the facing right to this line of stitching here and back stitch, and then you're going to trim off all of the bulk from here, a little bit of the bulk from this seam here, and turn it through. So I'll show you that again. Got the, this is the bodice, this is the waist seam, this is the facing, that's the waist tie. We've got the skirt here, and again this is the skirt side of the waist seam that we've just sewn. So your facing is free, so you fold your facing back on itself so that the right side of the facing is touching the skirt. Keep the tie out of the way because you really don't want to get that caught in your line of stitching. So you've got the right side of the facing to the wrong side of the skirt, and you're going to be looking at it from, this is the bodice side, and we're going to sew from this edge of the facing along this stitching line that you've just done for the waist up to the edge there, and trim off the excess. Okay, so I have sewn, and if anything I've erred on the side of caution and into the seam allowance rather onto the bodice, but I've back stitched here, sewn across, back stitched here. So I now need to trim off this excess bulk here, and I'm going to trim off that extra bit of seam there. And now I'm going to turn this out the right way. And it's going to need a damn good press. But here we go. So got that bit finished. And that's what it looks like from the inside. So yeah, we need to press all of this and then we're nearly finished. Just need to put in the buttonhole for my waist tie to pass through and then we're done. So I'm going to give it a really good press. I'm going to press the seam allowance of the waistband, which I haven't done yet. I'm going to press that all up towards the top of the dress, towards the bodice. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is actually put the buttonhole in where we should have left the gap opening, and that is on the right hand side of the dress, because this is the back portion, that's the inside, so when you're wearing it your right hand side would be here. So it's the right hand side of the dress that I need to put the buttonhole into. Now I have a tiny little piece of, actually this is embroidery stabilizer, but interfacing will work just as well. Just don't press it on. This does have glue on it and you don't want to press it on, you just want to use this as a stabilizer whilst you're sewing the buttons, and then you can tear this away. So I'm going to set my machine to do a buttonhole. Now my ties, so my ties are just over an inch wide, an inch and a quarter wide. So I actually want to do a buttonhole on mine that's probably going to be, oh, and this is, he's made, when I had mine serviced, he's made the machine very, very sensitive. So I'm going to make mine 3/4 of an inch long, maybe just a little bit longer. There we go. Yeah, just an inch. I've made my buttonhole an inch long, and I'm going to place it, and this is the right hand side of the dress as it's being worn. So there's the front, this is the side seam. Now I've put my I French seamed and pressed my seam towards the back, so I'm actually going to put the buttonhole in on top of that French seam because there's more fabric there which will give it a little bit more stability. And I'm going to start at the bottom, just inside, just here, and I'm going to move, because I've pressed my waist seam up, I'm going to move the waist seam out of the way so I don't catch that. I'm going to start about 1/4 of an inch up from the waist seam, and I'm going to sew my buttonhole into and on top of the bodice seam, and I'm going to place my stabilizer, my interfacing, over the top of that, and sew the buttonhole in there. When it's finished, I'll rip this away, I'll use some fray check on it and then open it up. Okay, so I have my buttonhole in. It did go a little bit squiffy, but that's not the end of the world. So I'm now going to rip away this interfacing. Get my fray check out, and you want to be careful with fray check because it can get away from you and get all over the place. Ask me how I know. I'm gonna fray check all of that, and then once that's dried a little bit, I'm going to run some fray check over the inside of the buttonhole as well. Once I've finished that and it's dried, I'm then going to open everything up with my seam ripper. Then the dress is finished. You're going to need to give it a really good press, but then you can wear your dress and show it off. Once your fray check has dried, you can put a pin along the end of your buttonhole and then use your seam ripper very carefully to open up your buttonhole. And because you've got the pin in the end, if you have to add pressure, which I am, you won't be able to go any further past the end of this because the pin is in the way. So we've opened that up. I'm going to give it a little trim because there are some extra spare threads there, so I'm going to trim those out and then we're finished. So if you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. So I absolutely love this dress. I think it's beautiful. I really like the way it moves. I am going to fuss with the neckline a little bit on this. It doesn't gape, but the facings are slightly rolling out. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to run a line of stitching just anchoring the facing down, and because of the flounce I'm going to do that very close to this front edge, and because I've added the flounce from view C, nobody's ever going to see that. So I may actually create a lining piece for the front and back of this dress in the future, rather than do a facing and a bias binding at the back neckline, but I'm not 100% sure as yet. If I do that, I will be sure to film the process and I will add it into this sew alongs playlist so that the extra video is at the end. But as it stands, I will happily wear this dress out in public because I think it is beautiful. In fact, I'm going to wear it out dancing this evening. It's going to be good for dancing. It's going to be a good twirly dress. This dress was actually picked by my Patreons, and there's going to be a list of names going along the bottom here. So thank you very much to every single one of you for taking the time to vote for this particular pattern and for supporting me and the channel and what I'm trying to do here. It is very, very much appreciated. Thank you so much. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!